All right, settle in, because this one didn't start as anything unusual. In fact, if you'd walked into the studio that night, November 3rd, 1980, you would have said, "Ah, just another smooth Monday on The Tonight Show." Lights were perfect, audience warm, band right on cue. And sitting across from me was Jack Lemmon. Now Jack wasn't just a guest. He was family on that stage. One of those guys you don't interview. You just wind him up and enjoy the ride. He was 55 at the time, right in the middle of a career that just refused to slow down. Fresh off serious acclaim, working with legends like Billy Wilder and Walter Matthau, and getting ready to promote another comedy. So everything was exactly how you'd expect. He's doing impressions. I'm setting him up. Audience laughing like they paid extra for oxygen. And honestly, it was one of those nights where you could have gone on autopilot and nobody would have complained. 12 minutes in, I ask him about his upcoming projects. Simple question. Easy transition. And that's when it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just something changed. Jack's smile slipped. Now, if you've watched someone as long as I had watched Jack, you notice those things. Timing, rhythm, expression. Comedy teaches you to see the smallest cracks. And this wasn't part of the act. He looked at me, and his voice dropped. "Johnny." And right there, I knew. Something real was coming. "Before we talk about the new film," he said, "I need to tell you something. And I need to tell America something. Now let me tell you something about a live audience. They feel it before they understand it. And that room went quiet. Not politely quiet. Real quiet." I leaned forward. "Of course, Jack," I said. "Whatever you need to say." And he took a breath, looked at the camera, then back at me. "I went to the doctor last Tuesday," he said. "Just for a routine checkup." He tried to smile a little. I'd been feeling tired, some pain I couldn't explain. Thought it was just, 55 years catching up with me. And I asked him, "What did they find?" And he said it, calm, clear, no drama. "They found cancer." Now I've heard a lot of words on that stage. Very few land like that one. "Colon cancer, stage 2. And for just a moment, I didn't say anything. Because sometimes the only honest reaction is silence. But then you remember, you're not just a host. You're a human being sitting across from another human being. So I stood up, walked around the desk, and I put my hand on his shoulder. Simple gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. "Jack," I said, "first of all, thank you for trusting us with this. Because I know that's not easy to say, especially here." And he nodded. "I wanted to say it here," he told me, "because this show, it always felt like talking to friends. And if I was going to tell people, I wanted to do it somewhere that felt safe." So I sat back down, and just like that, the show wasn't a show anymore. It was something else, something quieter, something heavier. The audience understood it too. No shifting, no whispering, just presence. So I asked him, "What happens next?" And he told us. "I've got surgery next Monday. They're going to remove the tumor, check if it's spread. The doctors are optimistic, but..." He paused. "There's no guarantee. There's never a guarantee." And then I asked him something that you don't usually ask on television, but it needed to be asked. "Are you scared?" And he didn't hesitate. Terrified. No joke, no deflection, just truth. "I've played characters dealing with crisis," he said. "But this isn't acting. I've got a wife, kids, friends, things I still want to do." And I leaned forward, because at that point, the script was gone. "You're going to beat this, Jack," I told him. "And whatever you need, I'm here. Not as a host, as your friend. And I mean it." And then something happened that none of us expected. An audience member, a woman, maybe mid-40s. She raised her hand. Now usually security moves faster than I do, but I stopped them. "Let her speak," I said, and she stood up, her voice shaking. "My husband was diagnosed with cancer 6 months ago, and he won't talk about it." She looked at Jack. "How do you find the courage to tell people? How do you deal with the fear?" And Jack looked at her, not like a celebrity, not like an actor, like someone who understood exactly what she was feeling. "You don't deal with it alone," he said. That's how. He took a breath. I spent 5 days hiding this, trying to be strong, pretending everything was fine, and it was killing me, almost as much as the cancer might. So I decided I'm not hiding anymore. And right there, something clicked in my head, because I realized this wasn't just a conversation. This was something people needed. So I signaled to Fred de Cordova, stretched the segment, and I turned to the audience. Is there anyone else here who's been affected by cancer? Hands went up, not a few, dozens. And suddenly, the Tonight Show turned into something it had never been before. Not a stage, not a performance, a room full of people telling the truth. All right, folks, now where were we? Ah, yes. We had just taken a perfectly normal night on television, light jokes, a little Hollywood charm, and somehow turned it into something that felt a whole lot more real than anyone expected. And let me tell you, once that door opened, it didn't close. So there we are. Jack sitting here, the audience leaning in like they're afraid to even breathe too loud. And suddenly this isn't a talk show anymore. It's something else, something honest, something you don't rehearse. Now Jack, he looks out at that woman in the audience, the one who just asked him how he found the courage, and you could see it in his face. He wasn't giving a Hollywood answer. No polished line, no rehearsed wisdom, just truth. He says, you deal with it by not dealing with it alone. And you could feel that land in the room. I mean, you could practically hear people thinking, yeah, that's it, isn't it? He goes on, says he spent 5 days keeping it to himself, trying to be strong, trying to act like everything was normal. And he says, that silence, that pretending, that was eating him up almost as much as the diagnosis itself. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's not something you usually hear between commercials, is it? So I look out at the audience, and I make a decision. Not a host decision, not a keep the show moving decision, just a human one. I say, is there anyone else here who's been affected by cancer? And folks, I gotta tell you, hands went up all over that studio. Not one or two, not a polite gesture. I'm talking nearly a quarter of the room. And suddenly, we all understood something at the exact same time. This wasn't just Jack's story. This was everybody's story. So for the next 15 minutes, and believe me, in television time, that's an eternity, we did something. The Tonight Show had never really done before. We stopped performing. We just talked. A young woman stands up, voice shaking, tells us she lost her mother to breast cancer. An older gentleman talks about his own battle, prostate cancer, and how he made it through. A teenage girl asks Jack how she can help her father, who's going through chemotherapy. Now think about that. A teenage girl asking for help on national television because she doesn't know how to help her dad. That'll get to you. And Jack? He answers every single one of them. Sometimes steady, sometimes with a little humor. You know that kind of humor people use when things get real serious. Keeps you from falling apart completely. And sometimes, yeah, sometimes with tears. And my job? For once, it wasn't to be funny. It wasn't to steer the ship or hit the next punchline. It was just to listen. You know, people think hosting a show like this is all about timing. And it is. But sometimes, the most important timing is knowing when not to say anything at all. And Jack says something that night. I still remember it clear as day. He says, cancer doesn't discriminate. Doesn't care who you are. Doesn't care if you're famous, rich, broke, young, old. Doesn't matter. And he says, that's terrifying. But then he pauses weak and adds, and somehow, it's also comforting, because it means we're all in this together. Now that's not a line you write. That's not something you workshop with writers backstage. That's something you realize in the middle of the storm. So eventually, the segment's got to wrap up. Television still runs on clocks even when life doesn't. And I look at Jack, and I make him a promise. I say, you're not going through this alone. And I meant it, not as a host, as a friend. I tell him I'm going to check in every week, not for the show, just because. And I tell him something else. I say, when you beat this, and you will, I want you back here. And I want you to tell everybody how you did it. And Jack, he smiles through tears, real ones, not the Hollywood kind. And he says, it's a deal. Then he thanks me. And I tell him, that's what friends are for. Now here's the part nobody in that studio saw. The cameras go off, the band wraps up, audience heads home. But that night, it didn't end there. The NBC switchboard completely flooded. I mean, they couldn't keep up. And these weren't your usual calls. No complaints about jokes, no requests for reruns. People were calling to tell their stories, to say thank you, to ask what they could do. The American Cancer Society reported something incredible. More calls in the next 24 hours than they'd had in the entire previous month. Think about that. One conversation, one honest moment. And suddenly, thousands of people are picking up the phone. People who had been hiding their diagnosis started telling their families. Families who had been avoiding the conversation finally had it. Doctors even started noticing something. There was an oncologist, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who later said that what Jack did that night probably saved lives. Saved lives. Because people who had been putting off checkups suddenly decided, maybe I shouldn't wait. And that's not television anymore, folks. That's impact. Now, what people really didn't see was what happened behind the scenes in the weeks that followed. I kept my promise. Every week, sometimes more. I'd call Jack, not as Johnny Carson, host of The Tonight Show, just Johnny. Sometimes we'd talk about treatment, sometimes about nothing at all, just normal conversation. Because when you're going through something like that, normal is a pretty valuable thing. I visited him in the hospital after surgery, brought books, jokes, anything to make the place feel less like a hospital room and more like, well, life. When he was too weak to go out, I'd go over to his place. We'd eat dinner, watch old movies, the kind of nights you don't think much about until later, and then you realize they mattered. And Jack said something about that time that stuck with me. He said, "You never made me feel like I was sick." Now that's about the best compliment you can get. Because sometimes people don't need reminders of what they're fighting. They just need reminders of who they still are. And 4 months later, March 1981, Jack walks back onto that stage, a little thinner, sure, but standing tall. And when I introduced him, that audience stood up. I mean, they were on their feet for almost 2 full minutes. Not for a performance, for a victory. And the first thing Jack does, he walks over and hugs me. And I'll tell you something, that moment, that wasn't television either. That was friendship. So we sit down, and I say, "You kept your promise." And he smiles, that same Jack Lemmon smile, and says, "I told you I'd beat it." Then he admits, yeah, there were moments he wasn't sure. And I ask him, "What got you through those moments?" And he says something I don't think anyone in that room expected. He says, "That conversation we had back in November." He says, knowing he'd spoken openly, knowing people were out there, watching, listening, rooting for him, it gave him something to hold on to. And then he talks about the letters, thousands of them, from people going through chemo, from families supporting loved ones, from survivors sharing their stories. And he says reading those letters made him realize something simple, but powerful. He wasn't alone. None of us are. And folks, that's where something really changes. Because that night in November, it started as one man telling the truth. But it didn't end there. It became something bigger. And that, well, that's where the story really starts to leave television behind and become something else entirely. Something that stayed with people long after the camera stopped rolling. And that's the thing, folks. Once something like that leaves the studio, once it gets out into the real world, you don't really control where it goes anymore. It just spreads. And in this case, it spread in a way nobody could have predicted. You see, after that night, after Jack sat here and said those words out loud, something shifted across the country. Before that, people didn't talk about cancer. Not openly, not comfortably. It was the kind of word people whispered. You'd hear it in hushed tones behind closed doors, like if you said it too loud, it might get worse. But Jack? He didn't whisper. He said it right here, on national television, clear, direct, no hiding. And because he did that, other people started doing the same. Celebrities, People the public looked up to began speaking more openly about their own health struggles. Families that had been avoiding those difficult conversations finally sat down and had them, slowly, piece by piece. That wall of silence started to crack. And organizations, support groups, research foundations, they all pointed back to that one night, that moment, right here, because suddenly, cancer wasn't something you had to hide. It was something you could face, together. Now Jack, he didn't just walk away from it either. He carried that experience with him for the rest of his life. He kept working, kept acting, kept doing what he loved. And he lived another 21 years after that diagnosis. 21 years, that's not a small number, folks. And when people asked him about it, about how he got through, he always came back to two things: early detection and support. That's it. Simple words, but they carry a lot of weight. Now, later on, after Jack passed away in 2001 from complications related to a different cancer, bladder cancer, his autobiography came out. And in it, he dedicated an entire chapter to that night. That night, out of everything in his career, Oscar nominations, legendary films, working with the biggest names in Hollywood, that's what he chose to write about. He said, "Johnny Carson gave me permission to be vulnerable." Now think about that for a second. In a world, especially back then, where men were taught to be tough, quiet, handle things on their own, he said that night showed him, and millions of others, that there's strength in saying, "I'm scared," that there's courage in asking for help. And he went even further. He said, "That conversation saved my life in more ways than one." Now, I'll be honest with you. You don't expect to hear something like that about a talk show. You expect laughs. You expect entertainment. Maybe a good story or two. You don't expect that. And yet, that's exactly what happened. That night became what people later called a watershed moment, a turning point. The way Americans talked about serious illness, it started to change right there. Doctors began referencing it. Counselors started showing it to families. Even medical training programs used that footage to teach people how to support someone going through something like that. Not with fancy words, not with perfect advice, just by being there, listening, letting someone feel what they feel, without trying to fix it. And I gotta tell you, that's a harder skill than telling jokes. Now, years later, people would ask me about the show. 30 years on television. Thousands of interviews, presidents, actors, comedians, you name it. And every time that question came up, what was the most important moment, I always came back to Jack, that night. Because it wasn't about ratings, it wasn't about headlines, it wasn't even about television, really. It was about life, it was about death, it was about friendship and courage and what it means to show up for someone when they need you. And here's the part that really sticks with you. That night didn't happen because something went wrong. It happened because something went right. A friend needed support, and I was there. That's it. No script, no plan, no rehearsal, just being present. And somehow, that simple act reached millions of people. So if you take anything from that story, and I hope you do, it's this. When someone you care about is going through something hard, you don't need the perfect words. You don't need a speech. You just need to be there. Listen, stay, let them know they're not alone. Because sometimes that's the difference between fear taking over and someone finding the strength to keep going. And Jack proved that, right here, on a night that started with a few jokes and ended up meaning a whole lot more. So, wherever you are tonight, if there's someone in your life going through something tough, give them a call. Sit with them. Don't wait. Because as we learned that night, the most important moments, they don't come with a cue card. They just happen. Good night, folks.